I want to tell you something I have been sitting with for longer than I expected. A few years ago, I went through a period of what I can only describe as a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being without people, because there were people, there were enough people, there were probably more people than I was capable of being genuinely present with. It was a different kind. The loneliness of being in rooms full of connection and feeling, somewhere underneath all of it, that the connection was not quite reaching the place it was supposed to reach. That the interaction and the warmth and the conversation were all happening at a layer slightly above the thing that actually needed contact. I spent a lot of time during this period on my phone. I am not proud of this in the sense that admitting it requires a performance of shame I do not feel. I am simply honest about it. The phone was there, and the phone was responsive, and the phone did not require the kind of sustained, uncertain, potentially costly presence that genuine connection requires. It was available in the way that genuine things are not always available, instantly, completely, at whatever hour, with the specific promise of stimulation that the algorithm had determined, based on everything it had learned about my attention, I was most likely to find compelling. What I noticed slowly and then all at once was that the phone was not filling the loneliness. This sounds obvious stated plainly, but the way it was not filling it was more specific and more interesting than the obvious version suggests. The phone was not failing to fill the loneliness by simply being insufficient, too shallow, too digital, too not quite real enough. It was failing to fill it in a more precise way. It was keeping the loneliness at exactly the level at which it remained uncomfortable enough to keep me reaching for the phone, but not so uncomfortable that I would have to actually do the thing that might address it. This is a system that has been designed, not conspiratorially, not by a single malevolent actor sitting in a room somewhere deciding to make me lonely, but systematically, structurally, through the accumulated decisions of an industry that has discovered with great precision and with genuinely impressive engineering that a person who is slightly lonely but still stimulated is a person who will keep engaging. And a person who is genuinely connected, genuinely satisfied, genuinely at peace, this person is a person who puts the phone down. I want to spend tonight talking about this, about what happened to loneliness, about where it came from and what it has always been and what, specifically, the last 70 years have done to it, about the companies and the structures and the specific mechanisms through which your loneliness has been identified, quantified, targeted, and monetized, about the philosophers who saw something like this coming, and about the ones who were surprised, about what genuine connection might actually require, as opposed to what we are being sold as a substitute for it, and about why, despite all of this, despite the fact that I am talking to you through a platform owned by one of the largest advertising companies in human history, through a screen that is part of the same technological ecosystem I am about to critique, despite all of this, I think the conversation is worth having. But before we go any further, if these long, honest, slow-moving investigations of the things that actually matter help you feel less alone at the end of a day that may have left you feeling more alone than you expected, please like this video and subscribe to Aphelion. Leave a comment. Tell me something real, not a summary of your reaction, not a performance of engagement, something true, even something small. I read these. The comments on this channel are genuinely some of the most moving things I encounter. There is something that I cannot explain about sitting alone in a room at some hour and reading the words of people from countries I have never visited who are lying in their own dark, thinking about the same things. That is a form of connection. Imperfect, strange, mediated by algorithms I have complicated feelings about. And real. Let's begin. Loneliness is not a modern invention. This needs to be said clearly before anything else, because one of the temptations of the critique I'm about to make is to imply that loneliness is something that technology created, that before smartphones and social media and the dissolution of traditional community structures, people were simply not lonely. This is false, and the falseness matters. The Psalms are full of loneliness. The desert fathers who retreated into the Egyptian wilderness in the 3rd century were, many of them, running from one kind of loneliness into another that they hoped would be more productive. The medieval records of hermits and anchorites, people who voluntarily walled themselves into small cells adjacent to churches and stayed there for decades, are records, in part, of people choosing a structured solitude over an unstructured loneliness that they found more unbearable. The letters of educated people across every century in the Western archive are threaded with the specific ache of feeling that the people around them cannot quite reach them, that the interior they carry is not accessible to anyone else, that the connection they want is not the connection available. What is new is not loneliness. What is new is the relationship between loneliness and commerce. The specific contemporary transformation in which the feeling of being alone, the ache, The reaching, the hunger for genuine contact has been identified as a market, has been mapped, measured, profiled, and sold back to the person experiencing it in the form of products that promise connection, while systematically preventing it from arriving. This transformation has a history. It has specific origins, specific actors, specific moments at which decisions were made that pointed in a particular direction. Understanding the history does not make the loneliness hurt less, but it changes its meaning, and changing the meaning of something changes what you can do with it. The modern commercialization of loneliness has its clearest origin in the post-war period in the United States, specifically in the 1950s and 1960s, when a confluence of developments produced the conditions in which loneliness could become a product category. The first development was suburbanization. The mass movement of the American middle class out of cities and into the newly constructed single-family homes of the suburbs was, in many ways, the spatial organization of isolation. The suburb was designed around the private dwelling, the individual house, the individual lawn, the individual car, in a way that systematically dismantled the accidental social infrastructure of the urban neighborhood. The street, the corner store, the building lobby, the sidewalk, all the places where people encountered each other without intention, where connection happened as a byproduct of proximity and shared space. These were largely absent from the suburban design. In their place were structures that required effort to connect. You had to drive somewhere, you had to schedule something, you had to make the connection deliberate. This is not a conspiracy. The suburb was designed around the car and the private home for economic reasons that had nothing to do with social isolation. The housing industry, the automobile industry, the oil industry, the highway construction industry, all found their interests aligned in the suburban model. But the social consequence of the design was real. A generation of people, particularly women, who found themselves in environments that were physically beautiful and deeply isolating in ways that had no name yet. Betty Friedan named it in 1963, in The Feminine Mystique, as the problem that has no name. She was describing specifically the loneliness of the suburban housewife, the woman surrounded by material comfort and social expectation, and the specific absence of meaningful occupation and genuine peer connection. But the phenomenon she described was not limited to women, and it was not limited to the suburb. It was the first large-scale articulation of a new kind of loneliness, the loneliness of a society that had organized itself around private consumption rather than public life. The second development was television. The television set, which entered the American home in significant numbers in the late 1940s and exploded through the 1950s, was sold, explicitly and successfully, as a solution to the isolation that the suburban design had produced. The TV guide, the talk show, the evening news, the variety hour, these were all, in the language of their marketing, about bringing the world into your living room, about connection, about community, about not being alone. They were also, of course, about selling advertising, and the specific form of loneliness as product that the television industry pioneered, giving you the feeling of connection while keeping you in a passive, receptive, consumable state, is the direct ancestor of the social media model that came 50 years later. The mechanism is identical. The scale and precision are dramatically different. The sociologist David Reisman, writing in 1950 in The Lonely Crowd, made an observation that reads now as almost prophetic. He described a shift in the character structure of modern Americans from what he called inner-directed individuals, people whose sense of self was organized around an eternal set of values and commitments, to other-directed individuals, people whose sense of self was organized around the approval and responses of others. The other-directed person does not have a stable internal compass. They have a radar, a constant sensitivity to what others are thinking, feeling, approving or disapproving of, responding to. And this radar, Reisman argued, produced a specific kind of loneliness, the loneliness of the person who is always monitoring external signals for validation and never quite receiving the internal confirmation that would make the monitoring unnecessary. He was describing 60 years before the invention of the like button, the psychological architecture that social media would eventually perfect. Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist, published Bowling Alone in 2000, a title drawn from his observation that Americans were bowling more than ever while bowling leagues were declining. His argument was about social capital, the networks of trust, reciprocity, and mutual obligation that are built through participation in shared civic and social life. He documented, across multiple data sources and multiple decades, a significant decline in this social capital, declining membership in civic organizations, declining church attendance, declining participation in clubs and associations, declining informal socializing with neighbors, declining dinner parties, declining card games, declining virtually every form of organized social connection that had characterized American civic life in the mid-20th century. Putnam's explanation for this decline pointed to several factors: suburbanization, television, the increasing time pressures of the two-earner household, and generational change. But the direction of his data was clear. Americans were becoming more isolated, more atomized, more reliant on private rather than public forms of connection, at exactly the moment when the infrastructure for commercializing that isolation was being constructed. The timing matters. The decline in social capital that Putnam documented was not simply a cultural shift that happened to coincide with the rise of commercial entertainment and eventually social media. It was, in part, produced by that rise. The hours that went into television were hours taken from the civic organizations, the neighborhood conversations, the informal gatherings that had previously built social capital. The passive consumption of connection was replacing the active construction of it, and each hour of passive consumption created the conditions for another hour of passive consumption, because passive consumption does not build the muscles that active connection requires. The philosopher Albert Borgman, whose work we will return to, described this dynamic as the replacement of practices by devices. A practice, in Borgman's analysis, is a form of engagement with the world that is inherently relational and skill-building. The practice of making music, of cooking and sharing meals, of maintaining a garden, of writing letters. A device delivers the commodity that the practice produced: music, food, beauty, contact, without requiring the practice. You do not need to learn an instrument if you have a streaming service. You do not need to cook if you have delivery. You do not need to write if you have a feed. What Borgman observed was that the device does not simply replace the practice. It gradually eliminates the capacity for the practice. The person who has never cooked does not merely lack cooking skills. They lack the relationship to food, to time, to the domestic space, and to other people that cooking builds. The person who has replaced letter writing with texting does not merely communicate differently. They lose access to the form of interiority that letter writing both requires and develops, applied to loneliness and connection. The replacement of genuine social practice by social media does not simply provide a substitute for the practices it replaces. It gradually erodes the capacity for those practices, the tolerance for the uncertainty and vulnerability that genuine connection requires, the patience for the slow building of trust, the ability to be present in a way that is not optimized for performance. Here's where the story becomes specifically contemporary and specifically commercial. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the internet began as something that people genuinely believed might solve the loneliness problem. The early rhetoric of connectivity was utopian and in many cases sincere. The idea that technology could connect people across distances, that a person in a rural community could find others who shared their specific interests, that an immigrant could maintain connection with their home, that a person whose identity was not legible in their immediate environment could find a community that understood them. This was not empty marketing language. These things happened. They are real. The internet did, for many people, create forms of connection that were not previously available. But the commercial infrastructure that grew around these genuine possibilities was built on a specific and important insight. Connection, as a product category, is most profitable when it is perpetually incomplete. Not absent. Absence produces depression, and depressed people are not good consumers, but incomplete, perpetually reaching, perpetually almost satisfied, perpetually encountering enough stimulation to stay engaged, but not enough genuine contact to stop needing more. The social psychologist Sherry Turkle, who has studied the relationship between technology and human connection more carefully and for longer than almost anyone, described this dynamic in her 2011 book Alone Together. She documented, across years of interviews with teenagers, families, professionals, and elderly people, a consistent pattern: people using technology to manage the risk of genuine connection, to be in contact with others without the vulnerability of actual presence, to communicate without the danger of being fully received and potentially rejected, to be, in her phrase, alone together, surrounded by signals of connection while avoiding its actual demands. Turkle observed that this was not a failure of technology or a misuse of tools designed for better purposes. It was the technology working as designed. Because the business model of social media platforms depends on engagement and genuine connection. The deep, satisfying, need-fulfilling kind produces contentment, and contentment produces reduced engagement. The platforms have an economic interest in providing just enough connection to keep you coming back and not enough to keep you satisfied. This insight was not accidental. The documents revealed by Frances Haugen's whistleblowing on Facebook and the various accounts of former employees of Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok all point in the same direction. The metric that the platforms optimize for is time on platform, and the emotional states that most reliably produce time on platform are anxiety, envy, and the specific dissatisfaction of comparison. The algorithm is not neutral. It has preferences, and its preferences are structurally aligned against the emotional states. Satisfaction, genuine connection, contentment, that would reduce engagement. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, writing in the early 2000s and with the prescience that came from having lived through the full arc of modernity's promises and failures, described contemporary social relations as liquid, in contrast to the solid social bonds of previous eras, bonds built on shared place, shared institutions, shared labor, bonds that were difficult to form and difficult to dissolve. Liquid modernity produces connections that are easy to form and easy to dissolve, connections that can be managed, curated, edited, unfollowed, connections that carry the promise of contact without the weight of obligation. This liquidity, Bauman argued, was not experienced as freedom, though it was marketed as such. It was experienced as vertigo. The ease of connection made each connection less meaningful. The proliferation of available contacts made genuine intimacy harder to prioritize and harder to sustain. The option to always be elsewhere, to swipe to a better match, to click to a more interesting conversation, to refresh to a more stimulating feed, made presence itself feel like deprivation. Why stay here when there is always the possibility of something better there? The French philosopher Guy Debord published The Society of the Spectacle in 1967, a decade before personal computers and 3 decades before social media. And he described with remarkable precision the social architecture that the attention economy would eventually construct. His central claim was that modern capitalism had undergone a transformation in which the primary product was no longer goods but images, representations of experience, of life, of human connection, and that these images were increasingly replacing the genuine article they depicted. The spectacle in Debord's analysis is not the images on the screen. It is the social relationship between people that has been colonized by images. The relationship in which what matters is not what you experience, but what you represent yourself as experiencing, not who you genuinely are, but the image of yourself you project into the social field. The spectacle is what happens when the performance of a life displaces the living of it. This is not a complaint about inauthenticity in the ordinary sense. Debord was making a structural claim, that capitalism, in its advanced form, had found a way to commodify not just goods but the texture of social life itself, that the connection, the recognition, the sense of belonging that human beings require for their psychological survival had been captured by the commodity form and sold back to them in degraded, simulated versions that preserved the appearance of connection while systematically preventing its substance. The social media profile is the pure realization of what Debord was describing, not because the people on social media are dishonest or performing in bad faith, but because the architecture of the platform is an architecture of representation. You are not sharing your life. You are building an image of your life for an audience that is simultaneously doing the same thing. The result is a hall of mirrors, everyone presenting their best version to everyone else's best version. Everyone privately experiencing the gap between their presented self and their actual self as a form of inadequacy. Everyone experiencing the curated lives of others as a standard against which their actual life falls short. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre described hell as other people, by which he meant something more specific than it is usually read. The hell of being seen by others, of having your freedom fixed by their perception of you, of being unable to escape the gaze that turns you from a subject into an object. Social media has constructed, at industrial scale, precisely this experience. You are perpetually visible. Your visibility is measured and displayed as a number. Your worth in the social field is quantified as followers, likes, views, engagement rates. And the specific loneliness this produces, the loneliness of being visible to thousands while feeling genuinely seen by no one, is a new kind of loneliness. A loneliness that previous generations did not have access to, a loneliness that is, if anything, worse than simple isolation because it carries the additional burden of the performance. The isolated person is simply alone. The social media user is alone while performing connection, which adds the specific exhaustion of the performance to the basic ache of the aloneness. The neuroscience of loneliness has, in the last 2 decades, produced findings that are both clarifying and disturbing. John Cacioppo, who spent his career at the University of Chicago studying the biological effects of social isolation, established with considerable rigor that loneliness is not a psychological experience that happens to affect the body. It is a biological state, as fundamental and as dangerous as hunger or thirst, that has been selected for over millions of years of evolutionary history. The mechanism is straightforward in its evolutionary logic. Humans are obligatorily social animals, animals who cannot survive without others of their kind. An individual human alone is extremely vulnerable, unable to hunt large prey, unable to defend against large predators, unable to care for infants alone, unable to accumulate the specialized knowledge that group living makes possible. The groups in which our ancestors survived were groups in which social connection was maintained and social exclusion was potentially lethal. The brain that evolved in this environment developed a threat detection system specifically calibrated to the risk of social exclusion. Loneliness, in Casiopo's account, is the activation of this system. It is not a symptom of a deficiency in the individual. It is a signal as specific and as biologically real as pain that the social connections necessary for survival are insufficient. What Casiopo found in his research was that this signal, when it becomes chronic, produces measurable damage across multiple physiological systems. Chronic loneliness increases the production of inflammatory markers. It disrupts sleep architecture, producing more fragmented sleep with higher levels of micro-awakenings. It increases the activation of the HPA axis, the stress response system, in ways that over time damage cardiovascular health, immune function, and cognitive performance. The lonely brain is literally a brain under threat, running a low-grade stress response that the body was not designed to sustain indefinitely. The research also found something more specific and more unsettling, that loneliness produces a systematic distortion in social perception. The chronically lonely person is more hypervigilant to social threat, more likely to perceive rejection in ambiguous social signals, more likely to withdraw from social situations as a self-protective measure, thereby creating the very isolation that the loneliness is signaling to address. Loneliness, in other words, is self-reinforcing. The signal produces behaviors that deepen the condition it is signaling against. This is important for understanding the appeal of the social media solution to loneliness. Social media does not trigger the hypervigilance. It does not produce the risk of rejection in the immediate visceral way that embodied social interaction does. The screen interaction is predictable, controllable, editable. You can delete a post. You cannot delete an awkward moment in a room full of people. The platform offers the simulation of contact without the biological risk of contact, and for the lonely brain running its threat detection system at full power, this is genuinely appealing. But, and this is the finding that Casiopo was most careful about communicating, the simulation does not satisfy the underlying biological need. The hungry body that is given a photograph of food does not stop being hungry. The lonely brain that receives digital signals of social contact does not register these signals in the same neural circuits that genuine social connection activates. The sense of being known, the specific, embodied, physically co-present experience of being genuinely seen and received by another person, involves neurological processes that a screen cannot replicate. The mirror neuron systems that activate in face-to-face interaction, the oxytocin released by physical touch and proximity, the specific quality of co-regulation that happens when two nervous systems are in the same room together. The platform does not know this, or rather, the platform does not care, because the platform's metric is engagement, not genuine well-being. And the lonely person who gets only temporary partial relief from the digital simulation is, from the platform's perspective, the ideal user, perpetually returning, perpetually seeking, perpetually not quite satisfied enough to stop. There is a philosopher whose work is not widely read outside specialist circles, but who anticipated the contemporary situation with an accuracy that still startles me, Hannah Arendt, in The Human Condition. Published in 1958, Arendt developed a distinction between three fundamental modes of human activity, labor, work, and action, and argued that the specifically political, specifically human mode was action. The capacity to appear in public, to disclose oneself to others, to initiate something new in the world that would not have happened without you. Action, in Arendt's account, requires what she called a public realm, a shared space in which people appear to each other as equals, in which the reality of the world is confirmed by its being seen and heard from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The public realm is not the state. It is not the government. It is the space of genuine plurality. The space in which the fact that we are all different from each other, each irreducible, each carrying an interior that cannot be reduced to another's, becomes the foundation for genuine contact rather than the obstacle to it. What concerns me about the contemporary situation, reading Arendt, is the systematic privatization of this public realm. Not privatization in the economic sense, though that is part of it. The privatization of the space in which genuine human plurality appears, its replacement by commercial platforms that simulate publicness while actually organizing everything around the individual profile, the individual feed, the individual metrics. You are not appearing in public when you post to social media. You are presenting yourself to an audience. These are different things. Appearance involves risk, uncertainty, the genuine possibility of being challenged and changed by the plurality of responses. Presentation is managed and controlled and, when it goes wrong, can be deleted. Arendt was also one of the most precise analysts of loneliness in the philosophical tradition, and she made a distinction that is directly relevant here. She distinguished between loneliness, which she defined as the condition of being abandoned, of being deprived of the company of others, and solitude, which she defined as the condition of being with oneself, of the two-in-one conversation that the thinking self conducts with itself. Solitude is not loneliness. It is the condition in which genuine thought becomes possible. It is the condition in which the self can encounter its own interior with something like honesty. What the attention economy does, in Arendt's terms, is make solitude impossible while making loneliness worse. It fills every potential moment of solitude, every moment of potential genuine encounter between the self and itself, with stimulation, notification, content. The commute that might have been a moment of solitude becomes a scroll. The queue that might have been a moment of thinking becomes a feed. The quiet before sleep that might have been a moment of genuine self-encounter becomes the algorithm's last opportunity to hold your attention for one more minute. The self that is never in solitude is the self that is never in genuine contact with itself. And the self that is not in genuine contact with itself is the self that cannot offer genuine contact to others, because genuine contact with another person requires bringing a genuine self to the encounter, which requires having met yourself. The German sociologist Georg Simmel, writing at the turn of the 20th century, made an observation about city life that reads as a description of social media 100 years before its invention. He described the blasé attitude, the specific psychological protection that city dwellers develop against the overwhelming stimulation of urban life. A cultivated indifference, a smooth surface, a reduction in the intensity of response to each individual stimulus because the sheer volume of stimuli would be unbearable if each were fully received. The blasé attitude, Simmel argued, is not pathological. It is adaptive. It is the psyche protecting itself from overstimulation by rationing its responsiveness. But the cost is significant. The person who has cultivated the blasé attitude to manage overstimulation has also necessarily reduced their capacity for genuine contact. The protected surface that keeps the overwhelming at bay also keeps the genuinely meaningful at the same distance. Social media produces a version of the blasé attitude at a scale and intensity that Simmel could not have imagined. The feed contains hundreds, thousands, in aggregate millions of attempts to capture attention, each one competing for the same limited cognitive and emotional resource. The only rational response is a kind of selective numbness, to scroll past most of it, to give partial attention to some of it, to reserve genuine emotional engagement for almost none of it. The blasé attitude is not a character flaw of the social media user. It is the psychologically sensible response to an environment designed around infinite stimulation. But the cost is what Simmel described, a gradual erosion of the capacity for genuine emotional engagement. The person who has spent hours scrolling through an infinite feed has trained their nervous system to ration its responsiveness. This training does not stop at the screen, it generalizes. The person who has been conditioning themselves to give partial attention to hundreds of interactions becomes, over time, a person who is less capable of giving full attention to any interaction. The person who has been conditioning themselves to move on quickly when something is not immediately compelling becomes, over time, a person who is less capable of staying with anything that requires time to reveal its worth, which is most of the things worth staying with. The philosopher Martin Heidegger, who is not always comfortable company, but who is often right, wrote about what he called Das Man, the they, the anonymous social world, the generalized other whose opinions and norms structure the inauthentic life. Das Man is not any particular person. It is the accumulated weight of what one does, what one says, what one is supposed to want and fear and value. It is the social script that most people follow most of the time without having explicitly chosen it, because the alternative, the genuine encounter with one's own freedom and one's own death and one's own singular existence, is too frightening to sustain continuously. Social media is Das Man made visible, quantified, and monetized. The follower count, the engagement rate, the trending topics, the algorithmic recommendation of what is worth your attention, All of these are the they in numerical form. All of these are the reduction of the irreducibly individual to the generally legible, the strange and specific to the broadly appealing, the genuinely yourself to the self that performs well for the available audience. Heidegger's remedy was not the rejection of das Man. He understood that complete rejection was neither possible nor desirable, but what he called authenticity, the capacity to own one's own existence, to make one's choices genuinely, rather than in mere compliance with the script, to be called back from das Man to oneself by the experience of anxiety in the face of death. Authenticity is not a state achieved once and maintained. It is a recurring possibility, a call that sounds and can be heard or not heard. The attention economy is specifically designed to prevent the hearing, not by suppressing it, by drowning it out, by keeping the feed running, by making sure that the moment of potential encounter between you and your own genuine existence, the moment of boredom, of quiet, of that specific restlessness that precedes genuine thought, is immediately interrupted by something more immediately stimulating. The notification arrives, the recommendation appears, the next video begins. The call is covered by noise. What returns in the silence that the noise rarely allows is the loneliness. The specific loneliness of the person who has been surrounded by simulation and who feels underneath all of it, the absence of whatever the simulation was substituting for. There is a specific form of loneliness that I want to name precisely, because it is the most common and the least visible. It is the loneliness that is invisible even to the person experiencing it, because the experience has been so thoroughly colonized by its simulation. This is the loneliness of a person who has a large number of online connections and almost no genuine intimacy, who is never technically alone and never genuinely accompanied, who knows, at some level, that the connections they maintain are managed and curated, and that the version of themselves they present to those connections is not entirely the version that exists in the quiet of their own interior, who have not had a conversation in years in which they felt genuinely seen, genuinely received by another person who took them seriously enough to be changed by the encounter. The philosopher Iris Murdoch wrote, in a passage I have returned to many times, that love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. She meant this as a description of moral development. The movement from the ego's solipsistic assumption that the world exists primarily as the backdrop to its own drama toward the genuine recognition of other people as centers of experience and meaning that are not less real than one's own. What she was describing is exactly what the attention economy is designed to prevent. The attention economy does not invite you to realize that something other than yourself is real. It invites you to construct an environment in which everything is oriented around your preferences, your profile, your feed, your engagement. The algorithm does not serve you content that will challenge your assumptions or expand your capacity for the difficult realization Murdoch describes. It serves you content that will confirm your existing preferences and keep you in a comfortable, stimulated, slightly hungry state that produces more engagement. Genuine encounter with another person, the encounter that has the potential to produce the realization Murdoch describes, is uncomfortable. It requires the genuine risk of being changed. It requires the tolerance for the other person's reality pressing against your own, their different experience, their different priorities, their different ways of being in the world. This is the encounter that the managed, curated, endlessly optimized social media connection is specifically designed to allow you to avoid. And what you are left with, when you have spent years in the managed connection, is the loneliness of a person who has been protected from the risk of genuine encounter. Protected, and therefore deprived. Byung-Chul Han, the South Korean-born German philosopher who has written a series of short, dense, urgent books about the pathologies of contemporary capitalism, makes a point that I find more clarifying than almost anything else I have read on this subject. In The Transparency Society and in The Agony of Eros, he argues that the contemporary demand for transparency, the insistence that everything be visible, measurable, shareable, immediately comprehensible, is fundamentally hostile to genuine eros and genuine love. Genuine love, Han argues, requires alterity. The genuine otherness of the other person, the fact that they exceed your knowledge of them, that they cannot be fully grasped or possessed or managed. The other person who is genuinely other is a person who can surprise you, who can challenge you, who can demand something from you that you did not know you had to give. This otherness is what makes love possible. It is also what makes love risky. And the contemporary social architecture, which is organized around the elimination of risk in all forms, the swipe left when someone seems inconvenient, the unfollow when someone is challenging, the blocking of what is difficult, is organized, in Han's analysis, around the elimination of the very otherness that genuine love requires. Social media does not make love impossible. but it creates a frictionless environment in which everything that is genuinely challenging about love can be avoided, in which the encounter with genuine alterity, with a person who is irreducibly themselves, who does not fit your categories, who makes demands that are not convenient, can be replaced by the encounter with an image of a person that you can manage at a distance. The result is a specific kind of eros poverty, an abundance of connections and a famine of genuine encounter. Many contacts and few of the experiences that make contact matter. The experience of being genuinely affected by another person, of being changed by them, of the encounter that leaves you different from how you entered it. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and emerged with a theory of human motivation organized around the search for meaning, observed something about loneliness in the camps that has stayed with me. He described how the prisoners who were most likely to survive, not physically necessarily, but psychologically, were not the prisoners with the most social connections. They were the prisoners with the clearest sense of why they were surviving, the what for that gave the how any meaning. In the ordinary context of contemporary life, far from the extremity that Frankl knew, his observation translates to this: loneliness is not simply the absence of others. It is the absence of meaning in the presence of others. The loneliest experiences I have had were not in empty rooms. They were in crowded rooms where the connections present were not connecting to anything that felt like it mattered. The attention economy does not address the question of meaning. It cannot address the question of meaning because meaning cannot be served as content. Meaning is not a thing that arrives through a feed. It is something that is built, slowly, and with considerable difficulty, through the specific practices that require the kind of sustained attention and genuine risk that the feed is designed to replace. The practice of caring for something over time, of developing a skill that takes years, of maintaining a relationship through its difficult phases, of doing the work that produces something real even when no one is watching. The loneliness that the feed addresses is the symptom, the meaning deficit that the feed was substituting for. This is the condition. And addressing the symptom while the condition deepens is not a solution. It is a business model. I want to say something about physical space, about what has happened to the places where genuine connection used to occur. The sociologist Ray Oldenburg, in a book he published in 1989 called The Great Good Place, identified what he called third places, the spaces that are neither home, the first place, nor work, the second place, but the informal gathering places, the pub, the cafe, the barber shop, the park bench, the community center, where people encounter each other outside the roles of domestic and professional life. These are the places where genuine community is built, in Oldenburg's analysis. Not the grand civic institutions, not the formal associations, but the informal, regular, low-stakes gathering places where people become known to each other over time. Third places have been in decline in the English-speaking world for decades. The suburbanization that Reisman and Putnam documented eliminated many of them physically. The suburb was not designed around gathering places. It was designed around private dwellings. The economic pressures of urban gentrification eliminated others. The neighborhood pub replaced by a wine bar. The corner store replaced by an Amazon locker. The rise of delivery services for food and alcohol eliminated the reason to go to the third place for what it used to provide. And the smartphone completed the transformation. The person who would previously have sat in a cafe and, by the simple fact of being present in a shared space, been available for the accidental encounter that is the material of community. This person now sits in the same cafe but is in a different world entirely. The headphones are on. The phone is in their hand. The presence is there, but the availability is not. What has replaced the third place is not nothing. The online community, the group chat, the Discord server, the subreddit. These are genuine forms of connection for many people, and I do not want to dismiss them. But they are missing several things that the third place provides and that turn out to matter more than the connectivity optimistic argument assumed. They are missing physical co-presence, the experience of being in the same room with other bodies, which activates the neurological systems of genuine social connection that digital interaction cannot access. They are missing accident, the encounter with people who are not already like you, who have not been algorithmically filtered to match your interests, who represent the genuine plurality of human experience rather than a curated sample of it. And they are missing what Oldenburg called leveling, the characteristic of third places where status differences are suspended, where the doctor and the bus driver sit on the same bar stools, where social position is irrelevant to the quality of the conversation. The algorithmic feed is the opposite of leveling. It is a machine for the quantification of social status, for the translation of every possible dimension of social desirability into a number that everyone can see. The follower count. the verified checkmark, the blue badge. All of these are the spectacularization of exactly the status distinctions that the third place existed to set aside for a few hours. There is a question I want to sit with honestly because it is the question that everything else in this conversation points toward. What would genuine connection actually require, as opposed to what we are being sold as its substitute? The philosopher Martin Buber, whose I-thou distinction we have visited in other conversations on this channel, wrote that the fundamental fact of human existence is the between, not the individual person, not the other person, but the space of genuine encounter between them. The I-thou moment is not a meeting of two already formed selves. It is a space in which genuine selfhood becomes possible, in which the person is called into genuine being by the genuine presence of another. What Buber was describing requires something that the attention economy cannot provide: genuine risk. The I-thou encounter is not a managed interaction. It is an exposure to something that exceeds your capacity to control, to another person's genuine otherness, their genuine interiority, their genuine capacity to see you and receive you and be changed by what they receive. This exposure is terrifying in the specific way that all genuine things are terrifying, not because they are dangerous in any physical sense, but because they are uncertain, and uncertainty is the condition that the attention economy is specifically designed to eliminate. The comfortable approximation of connection that social media provides is comfortable precisely because it is not an I-thou encounter. It is an I-it encounter in Buber's vocabulary, an interaction with an image of a person, mediated by a platform, filtered through algorithms, stripped of the genuine alterity that the real person behind the profile would introduce if you actually met them. You are not encountering a person when you scroll their feed. You are encountering their representation of themselves, curated for an audience. And you cannot be changed by a representation in the way that you can be changed by a genuine person. What genuine connection requires, and what the attention economy cannot sell you, is the willingness to be changed, to enter a relationship or a conversation or a community without knowing who you will be when you leave it. To make the investment of genuine attention and genuine vulnerability without being able to calculate in advance whether the return will justify the risk. This is not a moral demand. It is not the instruction to be braver or more open or more willing to be vulnerable. It is an account of what the thing that resolves loneliness actually is, the thing that, when you have it, makes the hunger of the feed suddenly comprehensible for what it was, a substitute that preserved the shape of the need while preventing the need from being met. There are things you can do. I say this not to offer a self-help list at the end of a philosophical video, the form of content that turns genuine insight into a protocol and thereby empties it of most of what made it useful. I say it because the question of what to do is genuinely different from the question of what the situation is, and because confusing the two is one of the ways the problem continues. The situation is this: a set of very large, very well-funded commercial enterprises have identified your loneliness as a market. They have built, with considerable sophistication and considerable success, products that simulate connection closely enough to generate engagement while failing to provide the genuine article closely enough to resolve the underlying need. These products are designed to be used, to be the default, to fill every available moment of potential solitude, to be the first thing you reach for and the last thing you put down. And they are succeeding. What you can do with this knowledge is not primarily to delete your apps or to implement screen time limits, though these are not bad ideas and have some evidence behind them. What you can do, first and most importantly, is to see the situation clearly, because the insight that Casiopo and Turkel and Bauman and Hahn and Arendt and Buber are all, in their different vocabularies, pointing at, is this: the loneliness you feel when you put down your phone is not a problem that the phone caused. The phone is treating a problem that predates it, with a treatment that doesn't work, in a way that prevents you from finding treatments that might. The loneliness is real and old and human. It is the biological signal of a genuinely social animal that needs more genuine contact than contemporary life is structured to provide. And the address for that need is not in the feed. What genuine connection requires, what actually addresses the loneliness, according to every source of evidence available, philosophical and neurological and sociological, is physical co-presence, sustained over time, in conditions of genuine reciprocity, being in the same room with another person. Being there consistently enough that the relationship can move through its difficult phases without dissolving. Being genuinely rather than performatively present. Present in the way that requires you to put down the phone and tolerate the uncertainty of a conversation you cannot edit. These things are harder to do than they used to be, in a world organized around private consumption and the simulation of contact. They require swimming against the current of an infrastructure designed to make everything except genuine connection easier. They require in a specific sense a kind of resistance, not to technology in general, which would be both impossible and undesirable, but to the specific replacement of genuine things with their simulations. The willingness to be bored rather than stimulated. The willingness to be present rather than performing. The willingness to let a relationship be what it is rather than what you have decided to post about it. None of this is a solution to the structural problem. The structural problem requires structural response, the regulation of platforms, the design of public spaces that invite genuine gathering, the economic policies that give people the time and proximity that genuine community requires. These are political questions that deserve political engagement, but they begin with the personal recognition, with the honest acknowledgement at whatever hour you are encountering it, that the loneliness you carry is real, and that the device in your hand is not going to resolve it, and that the resolution, partial, imperfect, always worth reaching for, requires something that you are going to have to build with your own hands in the actual world with actual other people, at the actual risk that actual contact involves. Tonight, in whatever room you're in, the loneliness that might be present is ancient and human, and not evidence of any failure on your part. It is the signal of a social animal that needs what all social animals need, to be genuinely seen and genuinely received by another person who is genuinely there. The algorithm that kept you awake until this hour cannot provide this. The profile you maintain cannot provide this. The follower count cannot provide it. But the person on the other end of a phone call you keep putting off can. The neighbor you have not introduced yourself to can. The friend you have been meaning to see for longer than you want to admit can. The conversation you keep managing from a distance instead of having directly can. The loneliness is the compass. It is pointing at something real. The direction it is pointing is not toward the feed. The feed is the wrong direction. The feed knows this. It does not care. You can care. And in the caring, in the honest acknowledgement that what you actually need is something that no product can deliver, and that the reaching for the product has been filling the space that might otherwise press you toward the genuine thing, something shifts. Not resolution, but orientation, the correct direction, the actual territory rather than the map of it. The dark holds the loneliness alongside you tonight, not solving it, not filling it with noise, just holding it as the real thing it is. The ancient human signal that you are a creature built for contact, and that the contact you have been given has not been enough. You deserve more than what has been offered. The loneliness has always known this. The morning will offer another chance to build toward what the loneliness is pointing at. But even knowing this, knowing the direction, knowing what the signal is pointing toward, there is a move that I want to name, because it is the move that most threatens to turn this kind of analysis into something harmless. The move that converts the genuine insight into a list of personal habits, and thereby lets the structures that produce the problem continue undisturbed. There is a specific intellectual move that I want to resist making, and that I want to name clearly so that the resistance is visible rather than invisible. The move is the one that takes a structural critique, a critique of systems, economics, architecture, incentive structures, and quietly redirects it toward individual behavior. The move that converts the analysis into a list. Here is what you personally can do differently. Here are the 7 habits. Here is the mindfulness practice. Here is the boundary you should set with your screen time. This move is tempting because it is genuinely partially true. Individual behavior does matter, and individual choices do have consequences, and there are things that a person can do in their own life that will improve the quality of their connection to other people. But the move is also a political one. It relocates the responsibility for a structural problem into the individual, and in doing so, it protects the structures. The loneliness that is produced by the suburban design, by the destruction of third places, by the gig economy's elimination of stable workplace communities, by the working hours that leave no time for genuine social investment. This loneliness cannot be resolved by 20 minutes of meditation and a digital detox, and the suggestion that it can is not neutral. It serves the interests of the systems that produced it. The philosopher Herbert Marcuse, writing in the 1960s, described what he called repressive desublimation, the way that late capitalism incorporates the desires that might otherwise fuel its critique. The desire for freedom is absorbed into consumer choice. The desire for connection is absorbed into social media. The desire for authentic experience is absorbed into the experience economy. The radical desire, met with a commercial simulacrum, is temporarily satisfied and thereby diffused. The individual wellness solution to structural loneliness is a version of this. The person who resolves their loneliness individually and privately, through better personal habits and more intentional relationship practices, is a person who is no longer pressing against the structural conditions that produced the loneliness in the first place. The resolution, real and valuable as it is for the individual, removes them from the population of people who might otherwise demand structural change. This is not a reason to refuse individual solutions. It is a reason to hold them alongside the structural critique rather than substituting for it. To know that your digital detox matters, and to also know that it does not address the fact that your neighborhood has no third places, that your working hours leave no time for genuine community, that the economic structure of your city has dispersed the social networks that used to provide belonging without effort. Both the personal and the political are real, and the insistence on the personal at the expense of the political is not apolitical. It is a choice with a beneficiary. I want to talk about what philosophers have said genuine companionship actually requires, because the philosophical tradition has spent more time on this question than it has on almost any other. And the answer it arrives at is more specific and more demanding than the contemporary discourse tends to acknowledge. Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, distinguished between three kinds of friendship. The first, which he called friendship of utility, is the friendship based on mutual usefulness, the working relationship, the acquaintance who can help you, the connection maintained because it serves practical purposes. The second is friendship of pleasure, the connection based on shared enjoyment, the person who is good company, the relationship organized around pleasant experiences. Both of these, Aristotle argued, are real friendships and not to be dismissed, but both are, in his analysis, incomplete. The third kind is what he called friendship of virtue, and here the translation is imperfect because the Greek arete, rendered as virtue, means something more like excellent character or genuine human quality. The friendship of virtue is the friendship in which two people genuinely admire and care for each other as the people they actually are, not as the functions they serve or the pleasures they provide, but as genuine individuals whose specific character and specific way of being in the world is what the other values. This friendship, Aristotle argued, is both rarer and more demanding than the other kinds, because it requires genuine knowledge of the other person, the kind of knowledge that only develops over time through shared difficulty and genuine mutual attention. And crucially, it requires genuine virtue in both parties. Not moral perfection, but the genuine development of character. The kind of person who is worth knowing in this way, who has sufficient interior life that getting to know them over time continues to reveal something worth knowing. The friendship of virtue presupposes people who have worked on themselves in a specific sense, who have developed something genuine in themselves, not a performed persona for an audience, but an actual character that holds up under the scrutiny of genuine intimacy. The attention economy does not develop virtue in this sense. It develops performance. It rewards the person who is compelling rather than the person who is genuine. It selects, through its engagement metrics, for the qualities that attract attention rather than the qualities that sustain genuine friendship. And the person who has spent years developing their performance, their profile, their brand, their curated self-presentation, has spent years on the wrong project for the friendship of virtue. They may have gained attention. They have not necessarily gained the interior life that genuine friendship requires and reveals. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, who worked primarily with children but whose insights extend far beyond that context, described the crucial developmental achievement of what he called the capacity to be alone in the presence of another. He meant the ability of a child to play, to be genuinely absorbed in their own interior world, while another person is present but not actively engaged. This capacity, Winnicott argued, is the foundation of genuine intimacy. Only a person who can be genuinely alone, genuinely at home in their own interior, can offer another person genuine company. The person who cannot be alone, who needs continuous stimulation, continuous input, continuous connection with outside sources of meaning and entertainment, is a person who brings their own emptiness into every relationship, who needs the other person to fill the space they cannot fill themselves, who cannot offer genuine company because they are always, underneath, seeking it rather than sharing it. The attention economy is specifically designed to prevent the development of this capacity. Every potential moment of genuine aloneness, every moment of boredom, quiet, undirected thought is captured and converted into engagement. The notification arrives. The autoplay continues. The feed refreshes. The specific tolerance for one's own company that Winnicott considered the foundation of genuine intimacy is never allowed to develop, because the development requires something the platform cannot monetize: genuine, sustained, unmediated encounter between the self and itself. The child who learns to play alone in the presence of a good enough parent, who develops the secure base from which genuine exploration of the world, including the world of relationship, becomes possible. This child is developing a capacity that the contemporary attention environment systematically works against, not out of malice, out of the economics of engagement. And the adult who has grown up in this environment, who has always had a device available to fill the space that solitude might have occupied, is an adult who may not have fully developed the Winnicottian capacity to be alone, who may experience the quiet not as a resource, but as a threat, who may reach for the phone not out of specific interest, but out of the specific discomfort of their own company. This matters for loneliness, because the solution to loneliness is not, in the end, simply more connection. The solution is the development of a genuine interior, a self that is genuinely worth keeping company with, that has the capacity to be alone, and from that aloneness to offer genuine presence to others. And this development requires exactly what the attention economy withholds: the time and the tolerance for genuine solitude, the willingness to sit with the discomfort of one's own unoccupied mind until something genuine begins to emerge from it. Let me say something about the specific experience of loneliness at night, because that is where we are, and because the night has its own relationship to the question. There is a reason that loneliness is most acute at night. The biological literature on loneliness, Cacioppo's work, and the work that has followed it, suggests that the hypervigilance that characterizes the chronically lonely brain is most active at night, when the threat detection systems that evolved to monitor for social danger run at higher sensitivity. The sleeping alone in an exposed position, without the protection of the group. This is what the ancient threat detection system was designed to prevent. And the brain that has been signaling insufficient social connection is a brain that, at night, is running its alarm systems at elevated sensitivity. This is why the phone is so compelling at 2 a.m. The alarm is running. The alarm says, you are insufficiently connected. You're exposed, you need contact. And the phone provides what looks like contact: light, movement, the sense of others present, the signal of response, in a way that temporarily quiets the alarm without addressing what is triggering it. The alarm returns often stronger in the morning. The writer and philosopher Simone Weil, whose concept of attention as the highest form of love we have visited elsewhere on this channel, wrote something about affliction, the French word malheur, which carries more weight than simple suffering, that illuminates the specific quality of the loneliness that is most acute at night. She wrote that the afflicted person is invisible. That affliction, particularly the affliction of social disconnection and the feeling of being unseen, produces an invisibility, a sense that one does not exist in the eyes of others in the way that one experiences oneself to exist, and that this invisibility is among the most severe forms of human suffering, because it attacks not just the feelings but the ontological ground, the very sense of being real. What the night loneliness carries, in Weil's terms, is a particular form of this invisibility. The sense of being alone in the dark in a way that no one knows about, that no one is attending to, that the world is continuing, without noticing the specific quality of this particular interior at this particular hour. The phone addresses this by making you visible, by giving you a stage, however small, however managed, but the visibility it offers is the visibility of the profile, not the visibility of the genuine self. And the genuine self, seen only by the phone's algorithm and not by any genuine other, remains invisible in the way that Weil was describing. The visibility that resolves the affliction, the genuine being seen that addresses the ontological loneliness, is not visibility to an algorithm. It is visibility to another specific person who knows who you actually are and has chosen, with that knowledge, to continue attending to you. This is what all the philosophical accounts of genuine connection, from Aristotle's friendship of virtue to Buber's I thou to Winnicott's capacity for genuine presence, are describing the experience of being genuinely known by a genuine other. The phone cannot give you this. No platform can give you this. The feed cannot give you this. But the world outside the phone contains people who might, with time and risk and genuine mutual attention, give you something close to it. Let me turn briefly to the question of solitude, not as a failure state that produces loneliness, but as a genuine resource for the person who has learned to inhabit it. There is a crucial distinction between loneliness and solitude that almost every philosophical tradition recognizes and that contemporary culture has largely collapsed. Loneliness is the involuntary, painful state of insufficient connection. Solitude is the chosen, cultivated condition of being with oneself, the state that Arendt called the two-in-one, the thinking conversation that the self conducts with itself. Solitude is not the absence of connection, it is a specific form of connection with one's own interior, that is the precondition for genuine connection with others. Paul Tillich, the 20th century theologian and philosopher, wrote that the courage to take solitude seriously, to resist the flight from it into distraction and noise, is among the most fundamental forms of the courage to be. Not because solitude is comfortable, it is often not, but because it is honest. Solitude confronts you with the actual quality of your own company. which is something that most people have powerful incentives to avoid confronting. The person who cannot be alone is the person who has not yet learned to live with what is in themselves. The contemporary attention environment makes this avoidance trivially easy. At any moment of potential genuine solitude, any moment of potential encounter between the self and itself, the phone can be deployed as an escape. And the escape is so immediately available, so low cost, so socially normalized, that it is barely experienced as escape at all. It is simply what one does when one is alone. What the development of genuine solitude requires, what creates the interior resource that can then be brought to genuine connection, is the willingness to stay with the discomfort of one's own company long enough for something to happen. For the mind to slow, to stop its anxious circling, to begin the more interesting and more difficult process of genuine thought. For the emotions that have been suppressed by constant stimulation to surface and be met with something like honesty. For the question of what genuinely matters as opposed to what is most immediately compelling to find space to form. Henry David Thoreau went to Walden not because he was antisocial. He walked into Concord regularly, received visitors, maintained his friendships, but because he had noticed that the quality of his engagement with life had been degraded by the constant noise of social and commercial life. He wanted to front only the essential facts of life, as he wrote, and to see if he could not learn what it had to teach. The experiment was not about isolation. It was about the quality of presence that becomes possible when the noise is reduced enough to hear what is actually there. We are not all Thoreau, but the principle his experiment demonstrates is available without moving to a cabin in Massachusetts. The quality of your presence in the world, including your presence to other people, is partly a function of the quality of your presence to yourself. And the quality of your presence to yourself is partly a function of how much genuine solitude you allow yourself. Not isolation, not withdrawal, but the regular encounter with your own interior that the phone-filled life systematically prevents. I want to turn to something that sounds perhaps too simple for the complexity of everything that has preceded it, but that I think is genuinely important: the specific role of boredom in genuine connection. Boredom has been largely eliminated from contemporary life. It is worth asking what has been eliminated alongside it. The philosopher Walter Benjamin, writing in the 1930s, described boredom as the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience. He meant that genuine experience, the kind that leaves a mark, that changes you, that becomes part of the permanent furniture of your interior, requires the prior condition of a certain unhurriedness, a certain receptiveness, a certain openness to what is actually present that the overstimulated, overscheduled, perpetually connected mind is incapable of. The egg of experience cannot hatch in the noise. It requires the specific quality of attention that only arrives when the noise has been quiet long enough for what is genuinely present to become visible. What is genuinely present, when the noise quiets, includes other people. The person sitting next to you on the train, previously available for accidental encounter, available in the way that the undirected attention of a bored person has the capacity to find genuinely interesting the specific person in front of them, is now unreachable behind their headphones and their phone. The encounter does not happen. The community, the small social tissue of genuine human contact, fails to form. Boredom was the condition in which the accidental encounter became possible, in which genuine curiosity about the specific other person, as opposed to the algorithmically recommended other person, could arise, in which the conversation that begins nowhere and ends somewhere unexpected, the conversation that is the basic material of genuine community, had the space to begin. The elimination of boredom has been sold as an unambiguous good. Why would you want to be bored? But what has been eliminated alongside the discomfort of the unoccupied moment is something that cannot be replaced by anything the attention economy offers. The specific kind of presence to whatever is actually in front of you that the distracted mind cannot achieve. There is one more philosopher I want to bring into this conversation, because his work is specifically about the relationship between modern technology and what he calls the thing, the ordinary object, the specific material presence of the world, and what I think is the most precise critique of the commodification of connection I have encountered. Albert Borgman, whom I mentioned earlier in the discussion of practices and devices, argues in Technology and the Character of Contemporary Life that the modern technological device does something specific and important. It delivers a commodity while concealing the machinery of its delivery. The central heating system gives you warmth without the practice of tending a fire. The streaming service gives you music without the practice of making it, or attending a concert, or even choosing what to listen to carefully. The social media platform gives you the feeling of connection without the practice of genuine social engagement. Borgman's concern is not that the commodity is worthless. Warmth is better than cold, music is better than silence, but the concealment of the machinery changes the human relationship to the commodity in ways that have cumulative costs. The person who has never tended a fire does not merely lack fire-tending skills. They have lost the relationship to fire, the specific way that tending a fire organizes time, attention, and the body around a real thing in the real world, in ways that the thermostat cannot replicate. Applied to connection. The person who has replaced genuine social practice with social media does not merely communicate differently. They gradually lose the specific skills and tolerances and capacities that genuine social practice builds. The ability to sustain attention on a person who is less immediately compelling than a curated feed. The capacity for the reciprocity of genuine listening. The tolerance for the misunderstandings and repairs that constitute the actual texture of genuine relationship over time. Borgman's prescription is what he calls focal practices, forms of engagement with the world that resist the device paradigm, that require genuine skill and genuine presence, that organize life around genuine things rather than commodities, running rather than watching running, cooking rather than ordering, playing music rather than streaming it, and, most relevantly here, genuine conversation rather than curated social media presence. The focal practice of genuine connection is not a protocol, it is not a technique. It is the willingness to be genuinely present to specific other people in specific shared space over time, through difficulty without the escape hatch of the profile in the feed. It is the practice of choosing the genuine thing when the simulation is available and more convenient. Not because the simulation is without value, but because the genuine thing is irreplaceable. Because the specific neurological, emotional, and ontological need that genuine connection addresses, the need that the lonely brain is signaling at 2 a.m., cannot be met by the simulation. The question the night is asking, quietly, is not, how do I get more followers? It is not, why are my posts not getting more engagement? It is older and simpler and harder than any of that. It is, am I known? By anyone? In the way that I want to be known. Not the curated version, not the performed version, not the version I have edited into legibility for an audience that I'm not sure is actually paying attention, but actually known in the way that requires another person to have spent enough time with me, through enough of the difficult and unglamorous parts, to have a genuine sense of who I actually am. This is the question the loneliness is asking. This is what the signal is pointing at. Not the number of connections, not the follower count, not the engagement rate, the quality of genuine mutual knowledge, which takes time and risk, and the specific form of courage that genuine presence requires. The difficulty of the contemporary moment is not that genuine connection has become impossible. It is that it has become structurally inconvenient in ways it was not always structurally inconvenient, and that the simulation of it has become so immediately available and so immediately stimulating that the willingness to accept the difficulty of the genuine thing requires a deliberate choice against the current of an environment organized to offer you the simulation instead. You can make this choice, not completely, not all at once, not by rejecting the technology that is now woven into every dimension of life, but incrementally, consistently, in the small decisions about where to direct attention and what to prioritize and which discomforts to stay with rather than immediately relieving. The phone call instead of the text. The visit instead of the post. The conversation that goes somewhere difficult instead of the conversation managed back to pleasant distance. The relationship allowed to be complicated rather than unfollowed at the first sign of friction. The presence offered to the specific other person rather than the performance offered to the general audience. These choices accumulate. They build over time something that the feed cannot build: genuine mutual knowledge, genuine trust, genuine community. The kind of connection that actually addresses what the loneliness is pointing at. The kind that makes the late-night scroll feel, not for the first time, like the thin substitute for a real thing that it has always been. Something I want to say before the silence comes. The fact that your loneliness became a product does not mean that your loneliness is a product. The industry found a market in it. The industry is not the loneliness. The loneliness is older and more human and more real than any platform that has tried to monetize it. It is the signal of an animal built for genuine contact, living in conditions that make genuine contact structurally more difficult than it has been for most of human history. It is the signal of a self that has been offered simulations and has known, somewhere underneath the stimulation, that the simulations are not the thing. It is the signal of a genuine need that a genuine industry has failed to meet while successfully charging for the attempt. Your loneliness is not evidence of personal failure. It is evidence of personal realness. The person who feels no loneliness in the conditions of contemporary life has either genuinely resolved the need for genuine connection, which is rare and requires work, or has suppressed the signal so completely that the alarm no longer sounds. The sounding alarm is, in this specific sense, more honest than the silence. The direction the alarm is pointing is not toward the feed. It is toward the world, toward the specific other people in it who are also carrying this signal, who are also lying awake at some hour with the phone in their hand and the loneliness underneath it, and the genuine need underneath the loneliness. Toward the genuine encounter that the phone was never able to provide, and that the morning, if you are willing to make it available, might. The loneliness is pointing at the right thing. It has always been pointing at the right thing, and the thing it is pointing toward, the genuine connection that actually addresses what the lonely brain is signaling, has a texture worth examining closely. Because the word connection has been so thoroughly emptied by the industry that monetized it, that we need to recover something more concrete. Something grounded in what it actually feels like when the thing is real, in the grain of a specific relationship over time. Friendship is the oldest name for it, not Aristotle's taxonomy. Exactly. That was useful as a framework earlier in this conversation, but it keeps a certain philosophical distance from the actual texture of what friendship costs and what it gives. What I want to talk about now is closer to the ground. There is a specific moment in any genuine friendship at which the friendship changes category. The moment is usually not dramatic. It does not feel, from the inside, like a turning point. It is usually something small. You said something about yourself that you did not intend to say, something that revealed more than your public self usually permits. And the other person received it without flinching, received it, in fact, as if it were interesting rather than alarming, as if the complexity you had just revealed was something they wanted to know rather than something they needed to manage, and in that reception, something shifted. The friendship moved from the managed variety to something that required more from both parties and gave more in return. These moments are the material of genuine intimacy. They are also, by definition, not moments that can be engineered. They cannot be optimized. They cannot be scheduled into a productivity system or produced by following a protocol for vulnerability. They happen in the space between two people who have been spending enough time together, with enough genuine attention to each other, that the managed presentation occasionally slips and the genuine thing beneath it becomes visible. What contemporary life systematically reduces is the condition in which these moments can happen. The condition requires time, not scheduled time, not optimized time, but the kind of slow, purposeless time that used to be produced by shared space and shared activity. The hours spent sitting in a pub or on a porch or in a kitchen that was not going anywhere in particular. The conversation that wandered without agenda through whatever the two of you happened to be thinking about. The specific quality of company that has no goal and therefore can find the unexpected. Social media does not produce this. It produces interactions that are goal-directed, toward getting a response, toward performing a self, toward generating engagement. Even the most intimate social media interaction is organized around the architecture of display and response. The architectural structure of the platform prevents the specific goallessness that genuine friendship requires. This is not a trivial deficit. The moments of genuine intimacy, the moments in which genuine mutual knowledge is built, in which the friendship of virtue becomes possible, these moments require, as their precondition, the kind of time and space that the platform does not provide and cannot simulate. I want to say something about the loneliness of people who are not alone, because the most painful form of loneliness is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of the person who is surrounded by people and still not reached. The person in the marriage or long-term partnership who has noticed, gradually and without being able to point to the moment it happened, that the conversations they have with their partner have become logistical. Who has noticed that the last conversation they had that went somewhere genuinely unexpected, that moved them, surprised them, revealed something about one of them that the other did not know happened so long ago they cannot date it? Who has noticed that the intimacy has been replaced by a kind of comfortable parallel existence, two people living alongside each other without genuine encounter? This loneliness is not a failure of love. It is, in many cases, the product of structural conditions that have nothing to do with the quality of the relationship. The working hours that leave both parties too depleted for genuine conversation. The parenting demands that colonize every unoccupied hour. The specific exhaustion of contemporary life that makes the scroll more immediately appealing than the conversation that would require something. But it is also, in part, the product of the same dynamic we have been tracing throughout this conversation. The systematic replacement of genuine practice by available simulation. The conversation that could happen has not happened because the phone was there. The evening that might have produced the unexpected has been filled with content. The marriage has been deprived of the specific conditions that intimacy requires in the same way that the third place has been deprived of the boredom and purposeless time that genuine community requires. The philosopher Rollo May, who was a humanistic psychologist as much as a philosopher, wrote that the opposite of love is not hate, but apathy. The withdrawal of care, the dimming of engagement, the specific absence of the genuine attention that says, "I am here, you matter. What you are and what you experience is worth my sustained engagement." Apathy, in May's account, is the emotional state most produced by the conditions of contemporary life. The overwhelm that leads to numbing, the overstimulation that leads to the blasé attitude, the exhaustion that leads to the withdrawal of genuine presence. The couple who scrolls in the same bed is not a couple who hates each other. They are a couple who has been so thoroughly organized around the availability of simulated engagement that the genuine engagement, which requires more from both parties, which risks more, which offers more in return, has gradually stopped being chosen. The sociologist Robert Bellah, in Habits of the Heart, published in 1985, and based on extensive interviews with Americans about their values and their social lives, identified what he called the language of therapy as the dominant vocabulary through which Americans were beginning to describe their relationships. The language of therapy, the language of needs, of personal growth, of self-actualization, of boundaries, of relationship health, had replaced the older languages of commitment, of obligation, of covenant, of the shared life as a good that exceeded the individual. Bellah's concern was not with therapy itself, which he considered valuable. His concern was with the colonization of all of social life by therapeutic language, the gradual disappearance of any vocabulary in which relationships could be valued for reasons other than their contribution to individual well-being. The relationship that requires too much and does not serve my growth is a relationship that, in the therapeutic vocabulary, should be ended. The community that makes demands that are not immediately rewarding is a community that can be left. The obligation that does not feel good is an obligation that can be examined and potentially released. This is not wrong as far as it goes. Toxic relationships should be ended, obligations that are genuinely harmful should be examined. But the exclusive application of the therapeutic vocabulary to all of social life produces a specific kind of atomism. The individual who has been taught to evaluate all relationships by their cost-benefit ratio, who has no vocabulary for the forms of loyalty and commitment that sustain community through its difficult phases, who relates to other people primarily as resources for their own development. The social media feed is the pure realization of this vocabulary, a curated collection of connections that you maintain for as long as they serve you and unfollow when they stop. The efficiency of the management is presented as a feature. You are in control of your social environment. You are not obligated to engage with what does not serve you. But the efficiency is also the elimination of the specific properties of genuine community, its density, its reciprocal demands, its refusal to be curated away. I want to return to something I said at the beginning of this conversation and say it with more precision. My own experience of that loneliness that technology was not filling. What I eventually understood, and this understanding came slowly, and I'm not sure it is complete, is that what I was using the phone to avoid was not nothing. It was something specific that I could name once I had stopped using the phone long enough to hear it. I was avoiding the recognition that the genuine connections in my life required more from me than I was currently giving them. Not more effort exactly. I was already expending a great deal of effort on the management of those connections, but more genuine presence, more willingness to be actually there, actually affected, actually changed by what the other people in my life were bringing to our shared space. More willingness to put down the phone and be in the room, actually in the room, in the specific way that actually being in a room requires. The loneliness I was experiencing was not a deficit of connection. It was a deficit of genuine presence to the connections I had. And the phone was not filling the deficit. It was providing a simulation of connection that was just stimulating enough to prevent the deficit from becoming sufficiently uncomfortable to require me to address its actual cause. This is a personal account, and I hold it with appropriate tentativeness. Not everyone's loneliness has the same cause. The loneliness of genuine isolation, of someone who has no connections, who is new to a place, who has lost the community that sustained them, is not the same thing as the loneliness of presence deficit that I am describing. Both are real. Both are worth attending to. The causes and therefore the addresses are different. But the presence deficit loneliness is, I think, more common than it is discussed. And it is specifically the loneliness that the feed addresses with such apparent relevance and such actual inadequacy, providing stimulation and social contact signals while doing nothing about the quality of presence that the underlying loneliness is seeking. The night you are in right now, whatever its quality, whatever the loneliness or peace or mix of both that it contains, is a night in which approximately 8 billion other people are also somewhere. Most of them are also carrying some version of this, some version of the signal, some version of the reach for contact, and the awareness that the thing reached for is not entirely satisfying, and the hope that there is something more genuine available somewhere. You are not alone in having this loneliness. This is not comfort in any simple sense. The universality of the experience does not resolve it, but it is a form of genuine connection in the specific way that honesty between people is a form of genuine connection. Not the connection of shared pleasure, which is easy, but the connection of shared recognition, which is harder and more lasting. The industry that monetized your loneliness knows you have it. The algorithm has modeled it. The feed has been calibrated to it. And none of that knowledge, none of that precision, none of that targeting has produced anything that actually resolves it. Because the resolution is not available as content. The resolution is available as practice, as presence, as the slow and risky and irreplaceable work of building genuine mutual knowledge with specific other people in the actual world. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote, "The love of our neighbor in all its fullness simply means being able to say to him, 'What are you going through?'" She meant this as a description of the highest form of attention. The attention that is genuinely other-directed, genuinely interested in the specific interior of the specific person in front of you, rather than using the other person as a mirror for your own concerns. This attention, she argued, requires the full quieting of the ego's agenda, the setting aside of what you want to get from the encounter, in order to be genuinely present to what the other person is carrying. This is the attention that resolves loneliness, not because it is sufficient. No single encounter is sufficient, and genuine connection requires sustained practice over time. But because it is the genuine article, the real thing, as opposed to the simulation. The specific experience of being genuinely attended to by another person who has genuinely set aside their own agenda to be present to yours. The phone cannot give you this. But the person on the other end of the phone, if you call them and say what is actually happening for you, and then listen to what is actually happening for them, this person might, with time, give you something close to it. The closing word is simple. Your loneliness was monetized before you knew it was happening. It will continue to be monetized. The industry is large, and the incentives are powerful, and the regulation is insufficient, and the individual choices are swimming upstream. But the signal underneath the monetization is yours. The need it is pointing at is yours. The genuine connection it is pointing toward is available in the actual world, to the degree that you are willing to risk the genuine thing, rather than settling for the managed simulation of it. You deserve the genuine thing. The loneliness has always known this, and knowing this, feeling the clarity of it, even briefly, even at this hour, is itself a beginning. But clarity is not the same as change, and what stands between the clarity and the change is not primarily a deficit of willingness. It is something more structural, something more specific. The distance between loneliness and genuine connection is not primarily a gap of information. You know that you need genuine connection. Everyone who has read this far knows this. The gap is a gap of activation energy, of the specific effort required to initiate something genuine in a world that has made the simulation more immediately available and less immediately costly than the real thing. The psychologist B.J. Fogg, who studies behavior design, argues that behavior is a function of motivation, ability, and trigger. The motivation to pursue genuine connection is generally present in people who experience loneliness. The ability is generally present. Most people know how to call a friend, how to show up, how to begin a conversation. What is missing is the trigger, the specific prompt that converts the general intention into the particular action. The attention economy has captured the trigger function completely. Every moment of potential boredom, every moment of unoccupied attention, every moment that might have prompted the genuine reach toward another person, these moments are immediately captured by the feed, by the notification, by the infinite availability of the simulation. The trigger for the genuine thing fires, and before it can activate the genuine behavior, it has been replaced by the trigger for the simulation. What this means practically is that the individual who wants to address their genuine loneliness does not primarily need more motivation or more information. They need to restructure the trigger environment. Not through willpower. Willpower is finite and the feed is infinite, but through the deliberate arrangement of a context in which the triggers for genuine connection are present and the triggers for simulation are reduced. This is not a self-help instruction. It is a structural observation. The conditions you arrange around yourself determine, more than your intentions, what you are likely to do. The phone charger outside the bedroom is a structural change. The standing commitment to see a specific person on a specific day is a structural change. The membership in a community that has a physical meeting space is a structural change. These are not solutions to the philosophical problem of the commodification of loneliness. They are the conditions under which genuine solutions become possible. The philosophical problem requires political engagement, the demand for regulation, for public space, for economic conditions that support genuine community. But the political engagement begins with the personal clarity about what is actually needed, which begins with the honest hearing of what the loneliness is saying, which is what the night is good for, which is why this conversation is happening at this hour and not another. The loneliness says, you need something genuine. The night has been honest enough to let you hear it. The morning is where the something genuine can begin to be built. But let me say one more thing. Because the morning will arrive with the same structures intact, the same available simulations, the same frictionless alternatives to the difficult genuine reach, what the morning requires, what all of this finally requires, is something that deserves to be named plainly: courage. Not the heroic kind, the ordinary kind, the kind that is harder now, for specific reasons, than it has been at most previous points in modern life. The philosopher Brené Brown, whose work on vulnerability has reached an unusually large audience for academic psychology, argues that vulnerability, the willingness to be seen without certainty of acceptance, is the birthplace of connection. Not the display of vulnerability, not the performed vulnerability of the social media post about your struggles, but the genuine thing. The willingness to show what is actually there to a specific person whose response you cannot control. What makes genuine vulnerability harder in the contemporary context is not that people have become less willing or less capable. It is that the architecture of contemporary social life has dramatically increased the stakes of social failure. When your social life exists partly on a platform where every interaction is visible and quantifiable, the risk of rejection is amplified. It is not just rejection by one person, but potentially visible rejection, potentially public rejection, rejection that can be screenshotted and shared and commented on. This amplification of the risk of social failure has predictable behavioral consequences. People become more conservative in their social risk-taking, more careful about what they reveal, more likely to maintain the managed presentation, and less likely to venture the genuine thing. The feed's quantification of social approval, the like, the follow, the engagement metric, has created a social environment in which the cost of genuine self-exposure is higher than it has previously been. And the loneliness that results from this conservatism, the loneliness of the carefully managed self who never quite risks the genuine thing, is a loneliness that the same platform that created the risk then offers to address through more managed connection. The cycle is self-reinforcing and commercially productive. The risk amplification increases loneliness. The increased loneliness increases engagement. The engagement validates the platform. The platform continues to amplify risk. Breaking out of the cycle requires the specific courage that Arendt called action. The willingness to appear in public, in the genuine sense, in the company of specific others whose response you cannot predict, without the safety net of the managed presentation. It requires the willingness to begin something whose end you cannot see, to offer something genuine to someone whose response might not be what you need, to be in relationship in a way that the unfollow button cannot protect you from. This is not heroism. It is the ordinary courage of a social animal trying to live genuinely in conditions that have made genuine social life structurally more difficult. It is the courage required to do what human beings have always done: reach toward each other across the uncertainty of genuine mutual exposure in a context that makes the reaching harder and the simulation easier than at any previous moment. It is worth the difficulty. The evidence is everything that the philosophical tradition and the neuroscience and the accumulated testimony of human experience has found about what genuine connection provides: the reduction of the biological stress of isolation, the development of genuine mutual knowledge, the experience of being genuinely known that Simone Weil identified as the highest form of love. You cannot get this from the feed. You can get it from the world, from the specific difficult work of genuine presence to specific other people, over time, through the difficulty that genuine things require. The work is available. The morning is where it begins, for now. The night holds what the night holds, the loneliness underneath the screen, the genuine need underneath the loneliness. The direction the need is pointing. You know the direction. Rest now and move toward it in the morning. Sleep.